Podcasting from a secret location deep inside the political colossus. This is Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance.
Part of the beauty of me is that I'm very rich. Let me tell you, I'm a really smart guy.
What's your name again? John Miller. And you work with Canada? Yes, that's correct.
Oh my God, they've got a madman on their hands.
We will have no truce nor parley with you or the grisly gang who work your wicked will. You do your worst, and we will do our best.
We've come to a turning point, a moment for hard decisions. If not us, who? And if not now, when?
It's 11:59 at Radio Free America, and this is Uncle Sam with music and the truth until dawn. Right now, I got a few words for some of our brothers and sisters in the occupied zone. The chair is against the walls. The chair is against the walls.
This is Radio Free GOP with your host, Mike Murphy.
Well, it is the morning after in an enormous upset. We're going to talk about that with ace pollster Dr. David Hill and talk about the new Republican Party with Bill Kristol. All right here on Radio Free GOP.
He used to have a big career, but now he's had enough. Podcasting's like therapy. His shrink says it's great stuff. Radio Free GOP.
Well, I'm here in New York City. It's the morning after the Trump hurricane, the perfect storm, and I, like many in my business, are completely shocked. I got this thing so wrong. I'm now the atomic clock of getting it wrong. Just about anybody who looked at politics through the way I was taught and had great success at it for a long, long time, looking at historical voting patterns, polling data, all the kind of data set analysis that we use, we got it wrong. It was interesting. I got the exit polls, and I had written down kind of my guesstimates of what the states would look like, and the exit polls that came back looked like my guess. I was so proud of myself, yet the exit polls were also completely wrong. Donald Trump has blown up the entire system. He has beaten both parties, the Republican and the Democrat, both establishments, and he's won in a pattern that is absolutely different than anything we've seen before. Florida was a state where in some more urbanized Republican areas, he did worse than the normal Republican number. Yet in others, he blew the exurbs, he blew the meter away. It is a phenomenal thing. That's why he's winning places like Wisconsin that we haven't won since 1984, or Pennsylvania. Both states that people who looked at it conventionally, like I did, because for the last bunch of elections, the conventional analysis was always right, he shouldn't have been able to win, but he did. I think it was a perfect storm. Both Trump's tapping into a new populism that's out there as the middle class gets squeezed and is looking for people to blame about it, and Hillary Clinton's epic meltdown, because she had all the king's horses and all the king's men, but in the end, Humpty Dumpty, they didn't want her. Now, it is a fact that she will wind up, when all the California ballots come back, with more popular vote, most likely, almost certainly, than Donald Trump. So we're going to have another election, the second in 16 years, where the Electoral College result is different than the majority vote result. And that's going to create all kinds of public concern, because most people think the Electoral College is kind of a crazy system they don't understand, but those are the rules we play by. So what do I have to say about it? I'm not sure. I've been a huge critic, as the listeners here know, of Donald Trump from the beginning. He did things in the campaign that repel me to this day. But I also want the next president to succeed. I've had it with American politics based on throwing acid at each other. So I'm not going to join the easy chorus of Trump complainers. I'm going to give him the room to rise to the office. He was gracious on election night, and more of that would help. So the worst mistake I think a lot of us could make would be to jump on Donald Trump and try to poison the politics of our next president before he even gets started. We ought to give him the room to try, hope he raises to the occasion, hope he shows grace, and carping about him is not going to do much about that. So here's what's going to happen on the podcast today. We're going to do an interview with my old friend Bill Kristol about what happened and where the party may be going. We'll get a lot of the inside baseball done there. And we're also going to do, this is a jumbo podcast, 2 interviews. We're also going to do one with noted pollster Dr. David Hill, talking a little bit about the interesting pattern we saw, very different, perfect storm kind of outcome. And then I'm going to bury the resistance transmitter in the backyard. We're going to shut the podcast down for a while. It'll probably come back as kind of an inside baseball analysis one day, but one, I need a few weeks off, figure out what I'm going to do and what I'm going to focus my time on. I have a lot of business things I do. I'm an investor in some tech companies. I like writing and show business. I'll probably keep doing some punditry, but I don't know. I'm going to go see my family and take some time and decide what might be the proper form for this podcast to take in the new world we're in. And frankly, shut up for a while and see if Donald Trump can rise to the occasion a bit, because that's what we should all hope for, because that is what the country needs. So the podcast will go on hiatus. Keep an eye on our website, radiofreegop.com, while we take a post-election break and figure some of this stuff out. You can also follow us on @RadioFreeGOP on Twitter. We have some announcements there as we sort it, and as well as my Twitter feed, @MurphyMike, though I'll be doing less of that now too. Now, kind of one last ironic, funny note to end on, because we try to be entertaining and funny on Radio Free GOP in unfunny times. I am here. I'm going to betray the secret location. I'm here literally half a block from Trump Tower. And across the street, a block away from Trump Tower, is the Peninsula Hotel, excellent hotel in New York, where Hillary Clinton was staying. So this was the capital last night of the NYPD and United States Secret Service as they guarded both of them. There's a thing called the great God of campaigns, which those of us who do this stuff learn not to tweak, not to step on Superman's cape, because when you get a little too cocky or a little too excited, the great God of campaigns always punishes you. Me relying on the traditional analysis, well, I got punished. I've never been so wrong, along with, I will say, almost all of my colleagues and almost every professional I know, including a bunch working for Trump. But the poor advanced kid in the Hillary Clinton world, where faces are long and hearts are broken this morning, who chose the Peninsula Hotel across the street and one block down from Trump Tower to be the place that Hillary Clinton was decamped before she left to her campaign election night event at the Hilton, well, the great God of campaign really smacked that poor person down, because I have a feeling, this is pure speculation, but often life imitates art. The advanced kid, like everybody in the campaign and every professional number counter just about in the party, in both parties, thought, hey, I know what we're due. We're do it right across from Donald Trump. One last flip of the nose while we go off to a triumphant victory. Instead, Hillary Clinton overnighted within listening distance to the happy cheers and howls outside Trump's fortress. It was a tough, poetic ending, and I'm sure the advanced people who picked the hotel are feeling horrible about their victory lap that would have been. So the sirens you hear in the background, and this is a close cardioid mic, we work with the excellent Shure SM58 here on the podcast, doesn't pick up much background noise, but if you did, you could hear bicycle racks being clanged as the security pulls back, and soon a cascade of sirens says, Hillary Clinton leaves New York City. So here we are, the morning after. We're going to go to a quick recap with Dr. David Hill on what happened last night, and then onto our interview with longtime Republican provocateur, conservative activist, publisher, TV pundit, and all-around good guy, a close friend of mine for more than 20 years, Bill Kristol. I hope you enjoy this post-election episode of Radio Free GOP. And again, keep an eye on the Twitter feed for when we eventually, probably with some revisions, return. But for now, time to bury the transmitter after this podcast. Thanks again for all your support, and I hope you enjoy this final edition of Election Year Radio Free GOP.
It's time to ask some questions and go behind the scenes. Here's our latest interview. We'll try to keep it clean. Radio Free GOP.
We're here with one of my dearest friends in real life and a great Republican strategist and political pollster, the one and only Dr. David B. Hill, or Dr. Doom, as I used to call him. Whenever he came in with a bad poll, he was always very honest about when things weren't working. And I can tell you, after last night, a lot of stuff's not working in how I saw the analysis, because I thought she'd beat Trump pretty decisively and particularly pretty early. But before we get into all that, and there's a lot to get into, I want to continue our Radio Free GOP tradition and start by asking you, David, how did you get into politics?
Mike, I'm ashamed to admit that I was a professor for 10 years. I was a professor of political science most of the time at Texas A&M University. And while I was there, I revived something called the Texas Poll. And we had a successful run of predictions for elections back in the day in Texas. And one day, a Republican pollster who had lost one of his staff members tapped me on the shoulder and said, come join the circus. And I took off my robe, my academic regalia, and became a carnival barker.
Now, I also know that, you have a lot of impressive political credentials, and we've been working together since the 80s and had a lot of successful races around the country. But whenever I introduce you with the friends, I have to admit what I think your coolest credential is that in your youth, as a young grad student, you did a little promoting on the side, and you are the man who brought the Rolling Stones to Alabama. Can you quickly tell me that story?
Well, it's been downhill from there. So that's the pinnacle of my. No, I was doing this kind of work, being a concert promoter, and I was in New York and at the William Morris Agency. And guy came up, one of the agents there, and said, "Hey, we just got a Rolling Stones tour. They want to do 2 college campuses. Would you like to do one?" And I thought it might be a trick question. I'd never been offered the Rolling Stones. We said, sure, we'd take it. And so they came to Auburn University that year and also went to Colorado State University.
What was it like having the Rolling Stones at Auburn? And were you kind of a shaggy rock and roll guy back then? You looked like Doug Henning with the hair and the rope belt. I want to know about David Hill. What year was this?
1969.
Wow.
November of 1969. And it was like, I believe, the coldest day before or since. Of course, the Rolling Stones did what rock stars do. We had shows set for 6:30 and 8:30. That sounds optimistic. They didn't even show up for the 6:30 show till 9:30. And then it was after midnight for the others. And so it was very cold. So there were a lot of beverages consumed, a lot of, the Rolling Stones in town is havoc enough, but to be 3 hours late and allow that much excess alcohol consumption before the concert made it more than interesting.
So you went to the madness of politics to get a little peace and quiet.
Exactly.
Did they kill? Did they perform well?
They did perform well, but the show that night, that tour, Ike and Tina Turner were the opening act, and they had substituted, because Ike and Tina Turner were booked this night, they had substituted Chuck Berry. Well, the whole thing was running so late, Chuck was enjoying it so much he kept overstaying his opening act time, and on the second show, they finally just literally unplugged Chuck's amp to make him get off the stage, but they performed well.
Everybody's a legend now, but day to day back then, it's still show business. And yeah, you may be Chuck Berry, but you're late and they pull the plug. Oh, the indignities. Speaking of indignities, every pollster that I know, though I'll give you some credit, you a month ago were flagging the idea that there might be a real surge in participation by non-college educated whites who might not even be registered to vote, but with same-day registration in other ways. The census found a ton of them, that there could be some real surprises, and boy, did we have one. What is your take now? We don't have all the data back. We're going to get the real precinct results. There'll be endless number crunching, but give me your 40,000-foot view of what happened last night.
Well, my first reaction is to sort of say somewhere Clint Eastwood of Gran Torino is smiling, in that a lot of angry old white men got out their shotgun and said, "Get off my lawn." That might be the explanation. But at least what I've been able to ascertain thus far from the exit polls, clearly the demographic profile was a little better for Trump than it would have been, say, for Romney 4 years ago. But it looks to me that like the driving force behind this election might have been actually some issues. It appears that in particular, whether you think building a wall between the United States and Mexico is a good idea or not, and how you think the battle against ISIS is going. If you think we should build a wall and that the battle with ISIS is going badly, you were extraordinarily apt to be voting for Trump last night. So what he sort of started out with, the immigration issue, may have in the end been a huge factor, particularly with getting a little better support from union members than Romney would have gotten.
It's interesting. One of the first states I was looking at, because my flawed prediction, and it was shared by just about every Democratic and Republican operative in Florida, and you can address this because you're a Florida expert, but first place I looked was Florida. And I noticed one of the first counties to report was Duval County, Jacksonville, reliable Republican area. And he was significantly underperforming Romney there. And I thought, okay, that kind of makes sense. He's not getting all the Republican, kind of what we admitted. The exit polls before they got weighted to the actual, which, is what we can look at now, were showing Trump down about 2 points in Florida, and it all kind of fit together. And then Hillsborough started to come in, which is one of the big Tampa counties. And again, he was running about 1.5 points behind Romney. So I'm thinking, okay, it's all falling into line here. Then some of the exurb counties, particularly the first two that really rang my bell, were Pasco and Hernando, north of Tampa, where Trump was off the charts. I mean, he was just crushing there like we never see in, swing counties leaning Republican. So Trump's composition was not the normal thing we see in when Republicans win, a state.
Right. Pasco and Hernando, I did notice those because they did come in early. And they're kind of like burly blue-collar guys who made enough as union guys to move down from the Midwest and retire. They're not your Tony Fort Myers type Republican retirees. They particularly didn't take a shine to Romney. He was just too slick, too Wall Street, too corporate. But somehow Trump's machismo seemed to resonate with those voters, and I think was a big difference in this race.
Yeah, you could see it also in Macomb County in Michigan, a state where we've worked a lot, where, Obama carried Macomb County. I think the auto issue hurt Mitt there by, I think it was about 3 points, 2.5. Well, Trump is going to pile up a decent lead in Macomb County, plus doing great in the Kalkaskas of the world, up in northern Michigan, small counties, but they add up in the aggregate. It was just interesting to see that Trump really in Trump places super overperformed.
Yeah, even when I saw Trump doing certainly better than Romney and like Detroit itself, Wayne County, that was a tip-off to me that there is something about old males, interesting, black and white, that just somehow were convinced to give Trump a try because they were looking for change.
Yeah, I'm sure Trump just killed in Western Wayne, which is, a whiter, people think Wayne is all the city of Detroit, but it's not. There's Western Wayne is working class, middle class, and I think he probably did well there. And then Detroit doesn't turn out like it used to be because it's been depopulated.
Right.
All of a sudden, Michigan's on fire from a Democratic point of view. And I think the real icing of the cake, it was funny. I'm sitting there on NBC with Carville, and both of our phones are going off, and we're calling people who know stuff and looking at text and all that between hits. And he's looking at Virginia, and he's thinking, the whole thing's going down if Virginia doesn't work. And I'm looking at Florida, knowing it's gone, and Virginia, the Northern Virginia may come in and do it. And all of a sudden, and we're looking at Detroit, saying, well, there'd be an Obama-like number, 300,000 net votes, which there wasn't. But we didn't know that at that time. We assumed it would be less. Question was how much less, which would be the outcome of Michigan, which I still don't think has been finally called. And then the TV blurts out the floor monitor that Ron Johnson's won in Wisconsin. And Carville and I looked at Jerry and we thought, she's done. Because if Ron Johnson won, Wisconsin's going to go. And we haven't won that in 84. So that's another place like Pennsylvania where the usual model was just warped.
Absolutely. And I think that, as a pollster, I'm often asked, how did the pollsters get it so wrong? We're going to have to parcel this out, but I would say, obviously a part of that was the modeling is probably off. It was different this time in terms of the composition. But I think there's also something to, and we saw this some in the primaries, that just systematically Trump tended to, in many places, perform better than the polls suggested. And we think there's two theories about this. One is that maybe people are ashamed or embarrassed to say they're for Trump. I think that's sort of a liberal media kind of bias. I think that probably a lot of Trump-type supporters just didn't participate in the polling process because they come to see polling as part and parcel of the establishment that they dislike. It's some convoluted combination of the media, academia, corporate interest. Polling is not the people in their minds. Polling is an enterprise, and it's not an enterprise that they see as on their side. It's not trusted. So I think a lot of Trump voters probably just weren't inclined to play the game when the pollster called or came through with an email invitation to an online survey.
Yeah, I think there's also, the Achilles heel of polling is we rely on history. We look at people, if a duck has been a duck for 8 years and wakes up one day and starts mooing like a cow, that is an unforeseen deal. it is paid in the past to use voter history to kind of weight to what people have done before and normal, quote unquote, turnout. Things revert to the mean. Well, the mean was out to lunch on this thing. It was not there. And so the polling where you kind of weight the demography and everything to history changed a bit. That is a blind spot, but it's never paid in the past to assume things that under conventional wisdom are crazy because, we've all been in races where, if only, the left-handed people turn out in a huge amount because we have a left-handed candidate, it'll change everything. And those things never come true. Well, this time, surge of a voter group beyond what was expected, and maybe some under-registration in the polling. People, like you say, were either not participating or not being completely transparent. Bingo. All of a sudden, 2 + 2 is going to be 22.
One of the model groups that I think is going to be very interesting to look at once we get the final numbers will be voters like under 35. They were, of course, essential, critical to Obama's election the first time. There was a lot of skepticism they would come out the second time, 2012. They did. I think we're going to see, and they were overwhelmingly, when they did vote this time for Hillary, I think we may see some fallback in the percentage of the under 40s, under 35s actually coming to the polls this time.
Yeah, it kind of feels that way. I mean, there had to be some turnout holes. Now, the media is all obsessed with Trump hit a big chord of this kind of nativist, this populist. Now we're, at least under his leadership, President-elect Trump, I'm learning how to say that, we're, not a party that's super free trade, all the kind of anti-globalism, all those issues, which I think were a big part of it. But the other half of this equation, in some ways, this perfect storm, is Hillary. This was quite a rejection of her, even though she will lead, I believe, when California comes in all the way, she'll hold her lead in the popular vote. How much do you think this was an embrace of Trump versus just a rejection of Hillary as a symbol for more of the same old politics and scheming and, all her personal negatives, as well as the fact that she was kind of the establishment figure?
Well, I sort of admired Trump's close from a strategy perspective. While she closed mostly with sort of, furthering the negative narrative on what a lout he is, Trump finally kind of pivoted over to the change message and saying that, Hillary had been at the helm during this long slide in everything from national security to job losses. And he wanted people to sort of focus on the change narrative, not just the anti-Hillary per se, but sort of tying Hillary to a set of policy failures that were deeply and personally affecting a lot of Americans. And I think in the end, that slight pivot to sort of an issue-oriented negative probably helped him more than her personal negative narrative about his language and scoundrel ways.
Let me ask you one more Florida question, because it's kind of, to me, the canary in the coal mine that was the early warning that things were going to go sideways for Hillary. You were doing some tracking there, and I know it was private. I don't know how much you can talk about it. And you weren't communicating with me, and you had Trump ahead. I got to give you credit at the beginning of the last week. Did that hold up? How did your thing finish?
Well, we finished Thursday night, and he was up 2 in our tracking for the 3-day roll. So that would have been like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night. And, frankly, I think a lot happened even after Thursday, but I felt that the 2-point margin was fairly well validated. At least in the exit polls, the very late deciders were a little bit more likely to be voting for Trump. So turned out kind of what we expected to see.
So now that we have Republican Party rule with the Senate and the House and Trump, President-elect Trump, I'm working on this. What kind of party do you think we're going to be? Do you think kind of the Trump economic populism message, will there be kind of a monkey see, monkey do effect with the senators and the House caucus and all that? Because Trump is not where a lot of the traditional Republican economic policy is.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems going to be is probably the House is probably going to change leadership, I'm guessing, and that there's going to be, a lot of movement, conservative Republicans. They're going to probably have an agenda of 100 different changes they want to make, fine-tuning of this or that and the other, as well as big issues. I think Trump may end up being more focused working on his immigration, working on some trade policy, working on some international strategic changes of direction. And I think there may end up being a huge fracas between almost maybe seeing the House as being the busybodies here, wanting to do more than Trump's ready to do, and maybe more than the Senate is ready to do. I don't see this Republican majority in the Senate being particularly activist like the House should be. So we may almost have a kind of a split, not a partisan Democrat-Republican split, but we may see a House split with the Senate and the White House on how aggressive to be over the first 100 days of Trump administration.
It's interesting, and I have no idea how to handicap it, but do you think Trump will double down on the economic populism of his campaign as president, or he'll make a run to be a little more accretive and reach out a little bit and take the tone down? What do you think his instinct will be?
I think he's going to pick a couple of issues, and it could be tax cuts and the wall, and probably be like a dentist drilling a cavity with those. But I think on secondary issues, maybe some of the trade deals, he may not be as aggressive in like going after NAFTA or some other targets that he's criticized during the campaign. You know, Donald Trump likes to think he's a man of stamina, but he's going to find out that being president and trying to advance a very broad agenda is going to be just as taxing as campaigning. And I thought he looked tired and worn out at the end of this one. He'll be tired after the first 6 months of being president if he tries to push too broad and deep an agenda.
This is an election where the smart guys were wrong, which I think will make a perfect title for this podcast. But if you listen to kind of the Georgetown set, it'll be Trump pivot, you know, Trump this, Trump that. If Trump backed off on the wall or backed off on the trade stuff, which will be the smart prescription by kind of the Beltway elite crowd, will that affect his constituency? Are they willing to forgive him much, or are they capable of having their hearts broken? Because he's built a special constituency here. How durable do you think it is on his personality versus his issues?
I really think that he's going to have to follow through on a couple of these core issues, or there's going to be a rebellion.
Yeah, because he'll be just another politician then, which is kryptonite.
Yeah, I can almost see the House trying to push some of this stuff and put it on his desk and then force his hand. Will he personally be urging the House and the Senate, going working senators to get them to vote for some of these items? I don't know, but it could be headed back the other way. I think you might even find on the wall, even in the Senate, you might find more receptivity to that as a hardcore, tangible Republican sort of issue that they might be kind of pushing here in the first 100 days. I'm buying futures in concrete blocks.
Yeah, that's probably a smart bet. One last question, David, before I go on to any social media outlet you might want to talk about where people can get David Hill content. But as somebody who was a little more tuned in, I think, to the Trump people than a lot of the consultants in the Republican Party I was talking to, a little more tuned into the opportunity, having him leading Florida and a few other things. Were you surprised by last night? Mildly shocked, totally shocked, or not shocked at all that he actually won, and he won the way he did in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin?
I was surprised, and not so much on just the substance of it, whether I thought his issues might appeal to a broader range of voters than, say, than Romney appealed to. I think it was more just, it was like a math problem. It was a calculus of the electorate. You know, it was hard for me to construct a world in which if Hispanic turnout, black turnout was kind of up to par, that a Republican would be able to thread the needle.
Right.
So really my skepticism was more mathematical, and that's why breaking down who actually did come to the polls is going to be important, because of the issue part of this. I thought actually, and as I said, I admired Trump's close. I thought he was on message with the change message at the end as the core of what his appeal was. If you want change, if you want to do things different, you got to vote for me. You vote for this woman, you're going to be voting for all the same stuff that you're dissatisfied with now. That was a great close. And so it was plausible from the argument standpoint. But, you know, one thing I've learned in this business over time is it's not necessarily always who has the best argument. It's sometimes just the person who, in the crooked casino of politics, who's got the best strategic demographic profile to push them along.
Yeah, that's totally where I was. I thought the demography would get him because the same trends we've seen for the last 4 elections would continue. But his message and where the country is and the kind of the economic frustration managed to warp, I think, the demography, which normally does not happen. But we will know as we dig in and take a look precinct by precinct at who really participated, because we're still looking at guesses right now. Anywhere people who are interested in what David Hill's up to or talking about can follow you? I know you still participate in the academic world, but they probably don't want to subscribe to the Wonk Journal of Statistical Analysis. Are you on Facebook or Twitter or any of that?
It's even more boring than that. I'm the most boring guy on Facebook in the world and got hacked, so I've not got back on since some Romanian took over my identity. I'm at Hillpole on Twitter, and so they can check there.
At Hillpole, Hill.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Hill, as always, illuminating. Thank you so much. I'm going on a vacation. I'm going to talk to Bill Kristol a little bit about the future of the party before he, goes into the witness relocation program. And I hope to see you soon down there in Alabama or Texas.
Okay. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for doing the podcast.
Bye.
Radio Free GOP.
Okay, that was the one and only David Hill, who has one of the more colorful backgrounds in this crazy business of politics. Now we're going to go to my interview, taped here on Wednesday after the Trump tornado, with Bill Kristol, publisher of the Weekly Standard.
Mike Murphy, podcasting sanity, Radio Free GOP.
So here we are in New York City, the center of the political universe, or the fall of Rome, depending on how you see it. The day after, it's almost noon. Hillary has not given her final concession speech yet, but here we are in the era of Trump. I'm with my guest and dear old friend, the Weekly Standard publisher, conservative, I would say public intellectual, international, square dancing sensation, and all-around good guy, Bill Kristol. Bill, thanks for being on Radio Free GOP.
It's good to be on Radio Free GOP. We're sitting in the basement of an unmarked conference room here, just a few blocks from the 2 blocks. Are we from the Trump Tower?
Oh, I'd say
I wore
one
my
block.
mask. I wore my mask over here, and no one stopped me. So far, so good.
Yeah, no, we're both figuring out: is it easier to escape town into the WITSEC program on the Greyhound bus, or should we hide in the trunk of a car?
But he won, and we all wish him well, honestly. I mean, he's the president-elect and will be the president of the United States. And I came to Washington 30 years ago to work in government, and you got to hope the president succeeds.
Yeah, no, as Americans, we got to get on his train and help him succeed, because he has the opportunity to do like he did in the campaign, exceed expectations.
No, I think that's really important. And I mean, obviously we have our views, and we probably agree mostly, they're not entirely, probably on the ways in which we can help him, educate him, persuade him, help people in the Congress, not always accede to him, but work with him. I don't know how much he thinks he needs our help, but at the end of the day, after you get through the recriminations and the feeling good about winning, which he deserves to, God knows, for a while, he's got to realize he's got to govern, and he'll want to be a successful president. And
I think so. I think maybe people will be underestimating him in that realm too. But before we get into all that, I always start these podcasts with a quick survey of how people got to be doing this for a living, this disreputable business we all seem to be in. So how did you wind up doing this?
That is a good question that I ask myself sometimes. I was chugging along as an assistant professor of political philosophy, really. I had an interest in politics. I'd volunteered in a couple of campaigns. I worked one summer for Pat Moynihan in 1976 in the Democratic primary. He was a friend of my parents. And I had an affinity with kind of Scoop Jackson Democrats at that point. I think I was 23, and I was a little, not bored, but wanted a break from graduate school, where I was allegedly reading serious books and becoming a serious scholar. And so I came to New York for that summer of 76. It was actually such a horrifying campaign. Pat Moynihan beat Bella Abzug by 1 percentage point in the primary, and the New York Democrats were not as crazy then as they are now, but they were getting there. So it was just kind of insane 2 or 3 months. But I learned a lot about politics, I thought, working in that campaign. But after that, I went back to taught at Penn, then I taught at Harvard. And I sort of thought maybe at some point I'd break out from the academy, but I had no great plans. And then luck intervened, as it often does. People ask me, how'd you plan this, or how did you strategize about your career? Young people today, especially, they're always strategizing. I mean, it was just luck, mostly good luck, thank God. at various points in my slightly zigzaggy trajectory. Bill Bennett, whom I knew slightly from sort of academic, quarrels about campus politics and liberal education sort of stuff, was nominated by President Reagan and confirmed to be Secretary of Education in the second term. Secretary of Education has a lot more political appointees than the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which was his previous job, where he had 2. He called me up and said, hey, come down for a year. You're at the Kennedy School. They kind of like you to know about government anyway. Write some speeches, be a special assistant, help me think through what good I can do as Secretary of Education. He was in the funny position of being a cabinet secretary of a department that President Reagan had vowed to abolish. So it was a little complicated how we were going to be a successful secretary.
You were probably for abolishing it 3.5 years into your good work.
Yeah, on January 21st, 1989, as soon as we finished our term in office.
As we turn out the lights, time to abolish it.
Well, that was kind of our attitude, but we tried. So how could we do some good was the question. And so I came to Washington to work for Bill. Like so many people who come to Washington, I came for a year. So I became chief of staff at some point in that year. I said, okay, I'll stay for a second year, take my leave. Harvard only gives you 2 years of leave. And so I gave that up. I certainly wasn't going to get tenure anyway. So we moved to Washington full time then in 87. And that was it. So then I took time off in 88 to run a Senate campaign, a losing Senate campaign of my grad school roommate, Alan Keyes. It was a doomed campaign. He did respectively.
The Ben Carson of his day. Beloved by the base, but terrifying to swing voters.
He got 38%, the exact same that the previous candidate had gotten against Sarbanes. He went a little crazier, frankly, after that. But that, I learned a lot. When people ask me, what should I do if I'm, you're a kid or even not so much a kid, to learn about politics. I think campaigns, and you would know more about this than I would, Mike, but campaigns are a fantastic educational experience.
Oh, they're great.
Government's great, but government, you're in a position, there's a huge bureaucracy, you report to someone. Campaigns are so fluid.
It's a guerrilla war. It's open source, particularly a challenge campaign. What I tell kids to do is, if you have the bug, definitely work in a campaign. Take any job. Any job. And when in doubt, don't get Washingtonitis. Go to the state capitol. Right. There always are great politics, or in a city and city hall if you're a Democrat. There aren't a lot of Republican city halls. There are occasionally a few. But don't be afraid to do that because there's less competition and you learn the same stuff quicker.
Right. And in Washington, I give similar advice, which if you come to Washington, don't get I'd like a job in a think tank, or my field of expertise is East Asia, or I'd like to work on the Hill for this congressman because I admire him. That's great if you can get the job you sort of dreamed.
But then you find out the brother-in-law, the third wife, all of a sudden,
Right. And any job, get in the system. Yeah. Think tanks, the Hill, campaigns, journalism, if you have a taste for that, trade associations even. The great thing about Washington, and it has its downside, but the great thing about Washington is the fluidity. It's not like of the jobs. And if you get in and you get a good reputation, if you get lucky and have a good boss, that's the other thing you should do is try to select a good boss. Yeah. You can move sideways, you can move up, you'll have some failures, some things won't pan out, but it's an exciting place to be. But the key is to get in there, keep your eyes open, be sort of entrepreneurial. And I think, look, it doesn't always work out. Some people have bad luck, some people have good luck. But in that respect, it's a lot of fun. It's not like becoming a lawyer and, you have 8 years here and then 6 more years at this level, or medical. Those are great professions. Washington and politics is very different. And for a certain type of person, I think, a lot of fun.
Yeah, and force yourself outside of your comfort zone because you learn something. Like you may be the campaign policy wonk on the lieutenant governor's campaign because of that, MBA degree you worked so hard to get. And somebody says, hey, the driver's sick. Well, I'm actually the No. Be the driver for a week. You'll learn more from that job than anything else in the campaign. Take whatever gig is in front of you.
Yeah, very much so. I came as kind of a policy guy when Bill called and asked me to come down in 85. I remember I had one more term at Kennedy School to teach in the spring, and I did that, of course. But I remember, going and getting books. This was pre-internet kind of, so there were still things called books, and there was actually a library you went to and got them at. I know people won't even
had typewriters in college,
able to imagine what this was like.
Yeah.
And I
remember the electronic Olivetti typewriters. It was half computer, half typewriter. Exactly. We thought it was like a moon launch.
No, that's what we had actually at the Kennedy School, right? And we just gotten beyond this electric. And I was reading up on education policy. There were other people at the education department who knew much, much more than I did about that. And it turned out I had a certain taste for, and maybe knack for, the more political side of things. And anyway, so I ran the campaign, worked for Bill, ran the campaign in 88. Dan Quayle, who I really barely knew, he'd been a senator on the education committee. So, Bill Bennett had dealt with him. As chief of staff, I dealt with him a tiny bit on some, minor things. I guess I was recommended to him when he was vice president-elect at the end of 88 as his domestic policy advisor. I went in and did that. And again, here's where luck matters. His chief of staff, very nice man, older man, had come from the Hill, just after 4 or 5 months in the White House, decided that wasn't for him, the pace, the hours, and all that. He got it going, which was sort of, I think, why Vice President Quayle brought him over. He got the staff set up. He got along with people in the West Wing. And then I got asked by the Vice President to become his chief of staff in the summer of '89. I didn't really, I knew him at that point, but I didn't know him that well. It was a kind of a gamble by Dan Quayle, which I very much appreciate. So then I was, senior staff level in the White House for 3.5 years. So these things are all, then we lost, got kicked out of the White House, packed up, everything.
Well, you guys ran a tight ship for Quayle because you decided, or Quayle decided, or collectively the senior staff there decided, which included Spencer Abraham, later a good friend of both of ours, later to serve as Senate, a guy I was on the phone with most of last night.
And that's how we met, if I'm not mistaken. Well, maybe we met a little bit before that, but the key, I remember you so well because Spence became my deputy chief of staff, and 1990, I guess, coming from Michigan, where he'd been state chairman.
Right.
And what was his main concern? Michigan, where he was from, and all his friends were there, and his then girlfriend, now wife, and you were there. You were there, I guess, or at least you were running the campaign. I was in D.C., but
you
were running the campaign.
He was the chairman. We had done Angler together, the kind of upset 1990 election of John Angler as governor.
So Spence came over in '90, and he brought Dan Quayle out to campaign for John Angler. The campaign
17 times,
exactly 17 times. I occasionally went on those trips. You ran that campaign, a great upset campaign, which you win by 10,000 votes or something like that.
A little more, but we were, 10 days out, right? We were down 11 points. So I've been on the other side of one of these Trump things many times, and so it is kind of a deja vu to see it happen to establishment guys like me rather than being the young insurgents.
Against an incumbent governor, you ran a great campaign. That's how we met. We had a lot of good times. I remember in 91, 92, I don't know if you remember this, I brought you in once as kind of Quayle's political advisor, kind of an informal role, to one meeting in the White House, and I think this was late 1991.
Yeah, they were all high-fiving each other about the high approval rating, and I'm looking around thinking I should have bought a new blazer for this, because I was a little scruffy back then.
And you and I both opined, and you probably slightly, I was still a little more politic than you maybe, but that, I'm a little worried about this. There's kind of a wrong track number out there that's like 60%, and ultimately Bush is the third-term incumbent with 2 terms of Reagan, and shouldn't we worry about that? And I just remember, I said it in a nice way, and you said it in a much brusquer,
I just said the wrong track is really high, and his approval is really high, so it's 2 trains are going to collide, and I'll tell you, the wrong track economic train is made out of tungsten, and it can beat us. He could lose. And I remember the room went silent.
Right.
And that is the last White House political meeting I was ever invited to in my career.
Yeah, and I spent the next couple of months. I don't really know who that guy was. How did he show up? Someone told me. Someone told me I should invite him, but no.
They looked at me like I was crazy. Bush cannot win, and I was like, oh my God! I wonder if there's a place. We didn't have the betting markets back then.
Right, and I was actually pessimistic through '92, and I guess was right about that. But we did our best with the Bush-Quayle reelection.
That was back when we'd call it right.
Yeah, I know. That was the difference.
Now here I am. I'm the idiot saying can't lose. I mean, he's a goner, and here he is, president-elect.
Me too. Anyway, that was sort of, and then I did some politics for a couple of years, Project Republican Future. You and I worked together to elect our very good friend Spence Abraham. I wouldn't say, as a wonderful guy, super smart political analyst, I wouldn't say a natural politician exactly.
Well, I think in the small room, he kind of was.
No, he's great.
He just wasn't the guy to drop into the middle of the 4-H rally. I mean, he could force himself to do it, but, he's a bookish, super smart guy. Kind of guy the Senate's designed for.
And he won in 94.
Yeah, he did.
That was a fun campaign.
I'll tell you one thing about old Spence 94. Nobody thought he could win, and he was a relentless campaigner. He really worked, but he's a brain, not really a glad-hander.
And so you won that. I helped Newt a little bit in those days, and we won the Republicans won Congress in 94. And then I thought, okay, that was great. But it became quickly clear to me in early 95, and this is, I think, where you sort of have to learn a lesson, not just rest on your laurels. I could have, at that point, I was featured a little bit in News Magazine, Newsweek at the time. I remember on the cover, successful Republicans, strategists. And people said, you should just start a consulting firm. Do you have access to Newt Gingrich? Do you have access to all these senators? Spence Abraham, one of your best friends. Maybe I should have, I don't know, but I didn't have much interest in that. And I thought the project.
Well, the problem was it didn't cause enough trouble for you.
Yeah, you have to get along. You have to be polite to people and nice to people. And
you're a conservative Bolshevik, not a Menshevik. You like to throw good bombs. And so do I. I mean, we got in a lot of trouble back then. Yeah. But didn't we have a good time?
We did, and we still do.
And we were on the right side, I think, of 99% of our arguments.
I do think that's true. I hope that's true. And but I did realize, I was smart enough to realize that Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House, Bob Dole as Majority Leader of the Senate, weren't really going to welcome some little group, the Project of the Republican Future, telling them, hey, do this, don't do that. And it's just, and I'd always, of course, had an interest, thanks to my father and others, in magazines and journalism. And this was somewhere in between, I would say, the academy and sort of the day-to-day politics. Fred Barnes was eager to take a shot at starting a weekly conservative magazine. And so he and I, John Podhoretz, others, started the Weekly Standard in September '95, and that's really what the main thing I've been doing.
And it was kind of a vacuum because National Review is beloved and august and everything, and they have part of it, but there wasn't really a Washington-based weekly political policy fusion magazine that was kind of fast on its feet, and that was the great idea of the Standard.
And we got a lot of then younger, now not so young, though still, thank God, pretty healthy and not too old, people to join, the young David Brooks, the young Chris Caldwell, the young Matt Labash, and then a lot of really young people sort of came along as in their 20s, almost out of college. Steve Hayes and others who've done pretty well. So I'm proud of what we've done. It's hard to believe it's been 21 years, and I've done some other things on the side, but that's really been my main job for 2 decades.
You will have forgotten this, but I was an active consultant then, but I was starting to fool around with punditry, and occasionally I'd write for the Standard. You guys were very kind to me. And you sent David Brooks, young David Brooks, and I out to cover the caucus in Iowa, or maybe the straw poll in Ames. It was when I was not working for Lamar, so I don't remember quite what election it is, but I always tell people now, I started out with David Brooks in journalism.
That's good.
He, of course, has gone on to Jupiter, and I'm
those who know, Mike,
eating crow on cable television all day.
I remember you were on one of the first Weekly Standard cruises. You probably don't remember this. We sat around talking about the economics of the cruise industry and chatting with the comedian. I mean, there's interest, the sociology and economics and I don't know, psychology.
The life below deck, because I had to leave 2 days early.
It's very interesting. Remember we had a talk with a comic who had not quite made it at Hollywood, and there he was doing cruise things. It was just an interesting kind of human thing. But I remember the audience, so there were 200 people there, Weekly Standard subscribers, kind of earnest, and this was our first one, so we weren't quite sure how to do these cruises. And Fred Barnes gave a talk, and I gave a talk, and others, panels on the Supreme Court and Congress, and God knows what topics for the war. I'm sure it was foreign policy. And you gave more of a political, how it works in a campaign, how it works in real life politics. And I remember one of the people asked a good question, how, I'd like to influence my congressman a little bit. How do I do this? I'm sure you have no memory of this. And I was wondering, what are you going to say? And you said, look, here's the one thing you got to remember. They all fly home. They work in Washington Tuesday to Thursday, basically. They have big staffs. They've got systems set up. You call there and say, I have an opinion on this issue or that. And they just plug it into the computer. One caller says you should vote no on, Obamacare or something. And you have no influence. Meanwhile, back in Des Moines, there's a small office manned by 2 or 3 people, the local office, the home office, and there's someone there who, probably the reception, the woman who answers the phone, who also drives out to the airport to pick up the congressman when he flies in at 8 p.m. Thursday night and drives him back. And that congressman always says, hey, what's going on here? What's the mood? What are people saying? So you've got to call the local office, talk if you can sort of figure out who to talk to, whoever the congressman's going to see, and put something in a bug in her ear. Usually it was a she, but it didn't have to be. And that's how you get to the congressman. And I remember all these, and it was very clever, and I thought, well, that's very interesting. And it was just, you did it in a very offhand way. But I remember afterwards, some of the guests on the cruise just saying, well, that was really great advice. And
every congressional reception is for 100 miles.
Thursday at 5 p.m.
What about the gold standard? How long you got on the phone? Yeah, exactly. So now the Weekly Standard is still going on strong, and what is it, 20-some years
21
now?
years. It started in September 1995. Newt Gingrich on the cover.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes, and look, it was sort of looking ahead to a governing Republicanism. Clinton promptly got himself reelected in 96. Then we went through a lot of turmoil, and it's been a very interesting 20 years. I hope we've done some good, and it's, you look at Donald Trump winning the presidency and you think to yourself, gee, that's really not what we kind of fought for 20 years, a kind of elevated conservatism that would incorporate the best of classical liberalism and of conservative thought and all this highfalutin stuff. And then you get I wish him well, and I hope he's a good president, but someone who wasn't in our mind as the model of the kind of leader of the Republican Party that we were hoping for. But you know what? Often life and history work in funny ways, and maybe he'll get influenced in all kinds of ways, or others will emerge as leaders under sort of the umbrella of a Trump presidency. So I don't think it's been at all for for naught. And at the end of the day, you don't know how ideas have influence. Some 20-year-old kid reads something somewhere.
Right, exactly.
And he decides, Tom Cotton, the young Tom Cotton, reads the Weekly Standard when he's at Harvard. He then goes to law school, joins the military. Now he's a senator from Arkansas. And,
24 guys read Marx in Russia, and look what happened. Ask the Romanovs. You know what I remember a little bit about those early days, which strikes me today on day one of the rule of Trump as President-elect Trump. I'm really trying to be good and learn.
And he's listening to
Yeah. Oh, no. We are half a block from the tower.
Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon. Right. Belted by gamma rays or Glenlivet. I'm not sure. Is at the beginning with Gingrich, Arianna Huffington was running around talking about Gingrich for president. And we all laughed more and more over the last 10 years. So here we are, Secretary of State Gingrich. She might have been right.
We published the only piece we published by Arianna. She was a conservative then, was a plea to Newt to run in '96, where she did actually have this one insight, which is one that Barack Obama, for example, understood, and Trump in a way understood, which is that you have a moment, and you run in your moment. And Newt's moment was probably '96.
Oh yeah, no, he was king of the world then.
And he's sort of, no, I'm just speaker. I'm this great being speaker. Then he runs in 2012, and by then it's like,
It's funny. He made the biggest decision in his life on a conventional basis, when normally he's at his best and his worst being totally unconventional.
No, that's really a good point.
So here we are. Let's talk a little bit. We were both pretty vociferous anti-Trumpers, a small but elite group of about a dozen leading Republicans, which I don't know how many are in chains already today as the roundup continues. But where we started, and then we'll get to maybe where we might be going. I opposed Trump because I thought there were character issues, and I'm not a protectionist. I'm not a nativist. I'm pretty liberal on the Republican immigration scale. So, on every policy level and everything, I didn't think he was my cup of tea, and I think he lacked any real knowledge or depth on foreign policy. So I had a whole suite of reasons to be against him. What about you?
Yeah, same. I mean, if he had just had questionable character in sort of his personal dealings and business dealings, but I thought would follow sound policies that would be good for the country, that would have been one thing. If he had had bad policies but was a man of impressive character, I could say, okay, we could argue about policy, but maybe he'll be right. It was the combination of the two that really made me just think he shouldn't be president. And even though he won the Republican nomination and surprised me by doing so, I can't say that he showed, he was an impressive campaigner, I guess you would, truthfully. Obviously he was. He got a lot of votes. But he didn't show me qualities either of character or of mind that made me think any more after he'd won the nomination than before he won it, that he would be a good president. So I continued to oppose him in the general election. And the voters elected him by a very, he won, and he ran a good campaign, I guess. What do you think? It was...
Well, in the...
It's so funny. Just one thing, you and I were both on TV last night talking about it. The thing that struck me was very early in the night when the exit polls were showing Clinton basically winning. There was an interview, ABC at least had an interview with one of the top Clinton people saying, we've targeted this very strategically. We're very confident that we've focused on the right places, resources, our schedule. And I think we've done a good job. The great irony is, so he wins the key states by 1 point, basically 3 of them, right? And he's going to lose the popular vote by, 1.5 million votes, it looks like.
Yeah, when all of California comes in, it could hit 1 million.
Yeah, it could be above 1 million,
probably surpass.
Yeah, so it's such a wonderful example of life not working out the way anyone thinks. The brilliantly targeted campaign, sort of wasted, so to speak, a huge number of votes. Not that they've had could do much about it. Wins the popular vote. Trump, who seemed to be randomly going to states that someone told him.
Campaign.
Someone told him, you have a chance. Why don't you go to Michigan? Guess what? He wins Michigan, right?
Yeah, there was a road show. There wasn't a campaign. It was like the Ice Capades. It was mid-size arena to mid-size arena. Here's what I think. I think it was a perfect storm, and there's more data to be looked at, actual precinct data, which will take a while. But on one hand of the equation, you had everything everybody was already saying about Trump. He hit a chord. He hit the zeitgeist. And when you have that moment, that hula hoop craze in the modern internet era with so much free channels of digital communication, you can tweet and 1 million people see it, Facebook. People can go peer-to-peer and share information. All that power now, which has revolutionized communications, you clearly don't need the apparatus of a campaign. Now, over in the Hillary world, the other half of the perfect storm, one, she was everything they didn't want. And we kind of knew that going in, but we thought the demography, the history of how groups vote would probably drag her across anyway, even though nobody wanted her. She had all the king's horses and all the king's men. She had all the apparatus, all the tactics, all the micro-targeting, all the heroes of the old Obama group who could do no wrong. But like all process coverage, they obsess on the plumbing, not the water. And in the water contest, Trump was where the zeitgeist is, and she wasn't. Now, footnote, we're conservatives. We pay attention to the free market. And as you just said, in the free market of votes, she got more. But we're in a situation now where the Democratic vote in particular is so geographically dense, the Electoral College punishes you for that. So I have a feeling there will be a reform movement to do the very arduous task of reforming that system, maybe taking the Electoral College out, because that was originally about balancing. And now you can argue it's a thumb on the scale. But bottom line, with the rules we got, and no campaign essentially other than pure message of the moment, activating people we never get. I mean, we haven't won Wisconsin since '84. Unfortunately for me, a lot of it was a grievance message. I think his policies, if he means it on protectionism, will hurt the people he wants to help. As his term, the forgotten people, more than anything any malicious enemy could come up with. He won. So, and she really lost. So the repudiation of her is the other big half of the equation that's not getting quite last night the attention I think it will now.
Yeah, I think we didn't take Sanders seriously enough in that respect. I mean, think what Sanders shows, how much Democratic voters didn't want to nominate the person who they were told was the wonderful sequel to Barack Obama, first African-American president. She ran a noble race against him, barely lost, served him, and now it was the first woman president.
Right, her turn.
This sort of Democratic identity politics narrative, plus the wife of Bill Clinton, who had been a successful, more or less two-term president before, the sort of best of all worlds. And the Democratic primary electorate, 44% of it, I think, wasn't buying it and went for Bernie Sanders. I mean, can you imagine if actually
I heard a Larry Summers
Biden or
joke.
Someone serious had run against her? But
I heard a Larry Summers joke that if Bernie Sanders had been slightly more of a historical Democrat and had learned to comb his hair, he would have beat her in the primary. But I think we all kind of knew back then, I think we all would have taken bets that Elizabeth Warren could have beat her in the primary. And that was a canary in the coal mine that we really didn't think through all the way. That weakness was not going away.
Right. And other things you said, and I think some I've said over the years were vindicated by this election. Not to say that, again, I just basically brought the conventional view, and it was the poll. No one's ever lost an election who was ahead in the polling throughout. There have been ups and downs, and people have come from behind a little bit. So, I mean, it wasn't crazy for everyone to say, gee, it looks like every poll shows her ahead. I think it was sensible for people like us to say, and Nate Silver said this, and I endorsed him, that it's like 2-1 or 3-1 or maybe 5-1 that she was going to win, not 50-1, which was kind of the tone of a lot of the media
I was
coverage.
a little farther out there because all election analysis that's been successful has been based on history. Voter patterns tend to revert to a mean. And so if you look at history and demography, that's why when those exit polls came back, I was like, that's exactly where I thought it was. And it all kind of added up. And then pow, everything's wrong because some of these trends were huge outliers with Trump. So now the problem of analysis will be people will say, well, the historical thing is clearly wrong, so the crazier theory next time will work. But the truth is you got to bet on revert to mean, even though we're all so discredited now. I'm going to stay out of the election prediction business because I was so wrong about this one, but I still believe in gravity.
So I don't think history was really discredited that much either, though, again, you look sort of like you're justifying yourself for something at this point, and I'm going to stay out of it for a while too. But I'll say two things. You always said, and I always quote you as saying this, ground game is wildly overrated.
Yeah, always has been.
Message Trump's money, and all those stories about Hillary Clinton's outspending Trump, which she was certainly in the key states,
and advertising
by 2
and
and 3
paid
to
digital,
1, and paid advertising, paid digital, and the noted ground game, which Trump had basically none. I mean, so that really turned out to be. I said this for 20 years, and then I sort of thought in this election, well, probably the ground game's worth half a point or a point. So in a really close election, it might help. Or it's got to mean something that you've got people organized to call voters and drive them to the polls and stuff, and get them early ballots. Boy, it really doesn't seem to. I mean, maybe it helped her a little. Maybe she would have lost even a little bit bigger if she didn't have the ground game. But it really was a reminder. Message trumps everything.
Everything.
And secondly, but history. I was with Ron Brownstein, our friend who used to write for the LA Times, now writes for the National Journal, who's really been pushing for 20 years, I'd say, what has turned out to be a basically correct thesis, the reversal of the parties in terms of the Republicans becoming the party of non-college educated working class whites, the Democrats becoming the party of college educated whites, especially college educated white women, especially postgraduate types, and minorities. And basically the demography favors the Democrats in this because more and more people go to college and the minority population goes up by a point or two every 4 years in terms of the electorate. But I was with Ron Friday. We ran into each other and took the Acela That's my way of getting in touch with Middle America.
Right, exactly.
I don't go first class.
You
I just go on the business class.
You avoid the quiet cars so you can listen into the bankers and the accountants.
The quiet car is the closest America has come to totalitarianism. I mean, did you ever go on that quiet car? People are nuts. You have cough and 18 women, if I might say something politically inappropriate here, it's usually a certain type of woman, just glower at you at best and shush you sternly at worst.
I have to admit that I'm often in first class because I like to avoid the working class Northeastern corridor pundits.
Exactly, right.
I prefer to hang out with I like it because I can get a single seat and not have to talk to anybody. But I do believe if you want to get in touch with America, go through the Northeast corridor on a French-designed train, because that, of course,
that's what
everybody in Kansas City is thinking about.
Chugged along from either New York to D.C. or D.C. to New York.
Exactly. Did you conduct the conversation in French, the language of world diplomacy?
Thank you. That we should have done that actually. But he has been right on this, and he
has been.
But he also said, and I said this too. I mean, at times, people overdo the demographic inevitability. And there are a lot of voters in Michigan, and he said this, in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. I think Ron wrote a piece about this. He was worried from his hoping Clinton one point of view that they were neglecting Michigan and Wisconsin in particular. I mean, their strategy was so North Carolina, Florida, Ohio focused. They were just taking for granted the blue wall. I think that's a term he invented actually, or used first. And he wrote something, I think, saying, what if Trump could end run sort of the blue wall and pick off those states? And there are still a lot of voters, white working class voters. And incidentally, Trump won white college educated voters, it looks like. By a few points.
Now that they've reweighted the exits, it was one, which when I saw that national number, I thought, no way he'll make it. That exit was wrong. Now they've weighted it to what looks like happens about 4.5 to 5, which is still 9 points under Romney, but he did so much better both in turnout and in share of those non-college educated white workers because he hit that big chord.
But too much of the coverage I thought last night was maybe on our network, at least when I was made it sound like the only people voting for Trump were rural voters and working class voters, and a heck of a lot of college educated voters voted for him for various reasons, good and bad. And a lot of people voted for him for decent reasons. I couldn't quite get there myself, but they didn't care for him in terms of his character. They didn't agree with some of the policies.
His numbers among his voters were not great, but he was the imperfect weapon to blow up.
But you know what? And this is the one thing I said, and this too, I think I also learned from you, because this was your message at that meeting we were discussing earlier in the White House in late '91. In a change election, the candidate of change has a lot of wind at his back. You can be an imperfect vehicle. Bill Clinton was a very flawed candidate. People they don't forget how flawed he seemed in '92. Ross Perot got 19 million votes, partly because Clinton was so flawed, but people didn't want the status quo. And that was the first President Bush, who incidentally, it's in retrospect, I always say this in speeches, I mean, it's a good lesson in a changed environment. I probably should have listened to myself more this year, because I said in all my speeches, the one thing I learned in '92 is in a changed environment, being the candidate of the status quo could be death. Was President George H.W. Bush really a very bad president? I mean, really, we won the Cold War without firing a shot? We had a little recession. He passed some good bipartisan legislation, maybe some not so good. But I mean, the idea that he plummeted, think about this, from 54% of the vote in 1988 to 38% in '92 is really an astonishing fall. And he wasn't that bad at all. Not at all. Ross Perot was kind of a nut. And, Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas, a talented politician.
But he and Gore together particularly were new and fresh.
Correct.
And that is the most powerful thing in advertising, is the word new when they're looking for change.
Especially when you get in a certain mood. And and the mood can be a little irrational. It can be a little, kind of build on itself. People want change, and then people say, yeah, we really need change because, things are worse than you realize. Drain the swamp. And that's, absolutely, really. So I should have taken that lesson from '92 even more to heart than I did.
Yeah, look, me too. I've always believed in it. And I found myself during the election saying, and I've said this a lot, the change wave is so powerful, it'll push a very failed candidate. And she is the perfect anti-change candidate.
Yes.
She didn't really have a message. I still don't know what it is. And she was third-term Obama, all those things. But I disliked Trump myself so much. I thought he's too heavy even for a change wave to carry. And that is where I got it totally wrong.
No, I had the exact same. We all use different metaphors. I was sort of, but I mean, it's the... I thought, he would just be too much of a lift. At the end, there'd be a little bit of a default to safety rather than change. I guess the conventional way people put it is, at some point, I mean, people want change, but, not change if it's going to be disastrous or too risky.
Right.
But it turned out they were willing to take a pretty big risk. I ran into people personally. It's now become like, you hear this anecdote all the time. People say, oh, yeah, he said these things, but he doesn't mean that. I mean, look, and I hear
just politics.
He was helped by this 70-year-old businessman, thought to be a successful businessman. We can quibble about that or not, but I mean, living in the penthouse of Trump Tower. You can't see, he's not on the street, right? And I think that really reassured people. You know, the media sort of thought all that was hurting him. He's older than Clinton. He's a businessman with all these deals, some of which have gone south and many of which are slightly dubious and even and all this other stuff in his personal life. I think people look, if you were a 40-year-old change candidate and you had other problems with your message and with your character, I think people do say at that point, and Clinton was hurt by this in 92. That's why Perot got so many votes. I mean, people say, oof, I want change, but I don't know, could this guy do it? With Trump, there's a certain sense of, hey, he's not going to do something totally crazy and rash. He's a rich guy in America who's been around a long time. He's going to, he says this stuff to rile people up, but he's not going to follow through. I mean, people said that. I don't know if it's true.
We talk a lot about partisan bias alleged. I'm not so sure about that in the media, but there is an ideological bias, and rich is suspect. If you're a rich liberal, well, you're a class traitor, and that's a good thing. If you're a rich Republican, you're bad. That's the media kind of sees that frame because you had to victimize somebody to be rich. And you can argue Trump University, maybe he did. But the rich thing, I think, was a credential for a lot of people out in real America. Now, the other thing, and I'm going to
just on that, and the media, I mean, this happened to me last night on ABC with good commentary mostly, but what's really crazy is that these people who aren't doing very well out there in, rural Wisconsin are attracted to Trump, who's a rich guy living in a triplex, is that what it's called, penthouse there in Manhattan. And how crazy is that? It's not crazy at all.
Yeah.
It often
is that way. But that's always been a Democrat worldview point of view. Mark Mellman, the great Democratic pollster, says that my party always think things are about economic class when really they're about culture. And that's the real schism, and we miss that because we think, well, why don't poor people and working middle class people all vote communist? Because we're giving more money. And they have some success with that, but fundamentally people vote aspirations. And Trump, if nothing else, is a success gospel kind of guy, at least perceived as that. Now, the other thing, and I'm going to knock this stuff off because I want President-elect Trump to be a success. So
this is one last blowout.
Yeah,
here
this is one therapeutic
Trump,
blow.
The tiny Never Trump cabal in the basement of a hotel, undisclosed location in
block
Midtown
from
Manhattan.
Trump Tower. He may come tunneling through the wall any minute. And I'm going to bury the Resistance radio transmitter in a secret location for a while and take a hiatus on the podcast because I do want him to succeed and I want him to rise in office. We're going to talk about that next. But I've got to say this for the record on the last day of Radio Free GOP as a pure Trump resistance organ. One of his lockpicks to get older working class guys who may not be that politically connected and may be Democratic even in their affinities in the upper Midwest is he pulled out something we haven't seen in American politics in a long time. It was like the gun to the knife fight. He brought race to the election. I mean, there's no question about that subtext. Every enemy had a racial dimension. It was either Mexicans tunneling in, Muslims with bowling ball bombs, or canny Chinese trade negotiators outwitting us. Frank Lavin. How many Chinese trade negotiators do you think outwit Frank Lavin?
Right.
Every time I have dinner with him, I can't find my wallet for 2 weeks. So
Frank Lavin is a Republican
old
who
friend
served
of ours.
in both Bush administrations in trade type positions
and
was
ambassador to Singapore.
Yeah.
And so anyway, my point being that was his special sauce, and the huge test, I think, of Trump's presidency is will he leave those tools aside now and aspire to be something bigger? And I hope he does, because then he could possibly even be a success.
I agree with that, and I'm usually the last person. I hate quotas. I hate kind of pandering to identity politics. I'm a kind of meritocratic, guy. I don't ask the race of people who write for the Weekly Standard, et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, he is president of all the people. We have a country that was, when you look at the numbers, the really shocking numbers, and a lot of upper middle class white people on TV are shocked by, hey, look at those white working class voters. But the truth is, the real gulf, there's a gulf between white working class and white college educated, but the racial gulf and the ethnic gulf is a little scary. it's not good for the country, And it wouldn't be good for the country, incidentally, if Hillary Clinton had won.
Yeah.
The main advice I would have given her is you've got to get to the, 57 million, whatever they are, Trump voters, and reassure them that you care about them and that you're not what they think you are, which is this limousine liberal.
Yeah, you can't live up to the caricature of the people.
But with Trump, I do think he has a real obligation. And, he needs to reach out, not just to people who didn't vote for him in general, but particularly to minorities who he has spoken about in ways that are not appropriate.
Yeah,
and that really were off the table in American politics, in respectable American politics for 20, 30 years. And it was a good thing that was off the table. And he put it back on the table. I kind of thought that would hurt him. But you think that helped him, right?
Oh, yeah.
Honestly, as an analytical matter.
I've done Michigan campaigns for a long time, and that's a state where he's down to, it's going to be a 5,000, 8,000 vote outcome there. It's really tight, a little Detroit left. I think in the end he'll probably get it by a quarter of an inch. But there are dog whistles there, particularly in industrial north, where I cut my teeth in politics, that he blows. And trade is a comfortable way to wrap it, but I'm offended when Bernie Sanders talks about profits as evil and everything else. Right. I don't like stupid leftism, but Trump added that racial dog whistle. And if he starts doing that stuff as POTUS, one, the country's going to divide even more. Two, he's going to have trouble in the cities. And then he'll go to like his nightstick instincts and everything. And that's going to be trouble. It's going to take a long time to unwind. So I am hoping that, as an optimist about our country, that Trump rises to the office. I don't know if he's capable of it or not. I thought his speech was gracious. He's going to need a good staff. So let's pivot a little to what kind of president do you think he'll be? We don't really know yet, but what kind of speculation? Can Trump evolve?
I mean, I guess the argument against it is he's 70 years old and he'll be feeling good that he won, but he's not a stupid man, and he knows that he wants, I think, to go down in history as a successful president. I think he's got to know that in some policy areas that means not, cavalierly launching a trade war with China or even with Mexico, incidentally, a place with which we have a heck of a lot of trade, and we want Mexico to be a successful country. It's kind of better to have a moderately successful country for all of its problems on our border than a basket case. Yeah, that was the theory of NAFTA.
Right, exactly.
And it wasn't
trade equals political stabilization.
It was not a stupid theory. And, so how much can he learn this? How much does he listen to people? I mean, he really needs to internalize the notion that being president of the United States is very different from running for president of the United States. That the fact that he was right and we and many, many others were wrong about how to become president in this cycle, both in how to become the Republican nominee and then how to win, doesn't mean that all of his instincts are just right about what to do as president. He can go with some of his instincts in terms of style and affect and all. I mean, obviously, he's not going to change who he is, and I don't begrudge him,
I'm looking forward to the White House uniforms. I think you'll get those old Nixon diagrams out with the 18th century hats.
Running the White House in a way that I wouldn't, if I were advising a president, and there's kind of the Andrew Jackson kind of element of, it'll look different, whatever, it'll be more vulgar than someone like me would like in a democracy, but that's democracy, and he won. I think the key is both on substance of policy, but I do think what you said, but also in terms of just tone, language, decorum almost in talking about groups of people, fellow Americans, whether they're born here. He has unleashed quite a lot. I mean, if you're on Twitter, it looks worse than it is, I suppose, in the real world. The degree of racism, nativism, anti-Semitism, and stuff that, again, there's a good reason that stuff was sort of taken off the table.
Right, no, it was an accomplishment of our politics.
The left did it by seeing, they overdid the political correctness in a big way, and I think that's one reason Trump won, probably. But, you don't really want to unleash. He has unleashed that stuff some in the campaign. He'll be president. I think he has the capacity to sort of put it back in a box. But a lot will depend on, I suppose, who he appoints, what he does as president, how he speaks as president, where he goes as president. A lot of the symbolic stuff would go a long way, honestly.
And will he get out of the bubble he's been in and get an ear for it? See, I have a hopeful theory, but I wouldn't bet on it because people don't change. But Trump has shown more than anything else in his career flexibility. He's been pro-choice, he's been a Democrat, he's been a Republican, Trump is not somebody with an ideological compass that does a lot of pointing. It's situational. So now I think there's a fair chance he's a canny marketer. He says, all right, I'm president, so this is a different ballgame and I want to be popular. So I'm going to change it up a little bit, and he will chase popularity. Now that could lead to Republican trouble because the Cruz, more fundamentalist, I'll say, or they would say constitutional conservative wing of the party, will be like, aha, if he doesn't live up to his promise on, say, the Supreme Court and just nominate the 5 names they pulled out of the National Review. Instead, he gets clever and says, well, I'm going to do one Democrat and one Republican. I'll please everybody. He'll start thinking like a marketer. I'm going to have a mid-priced hotel, a high-priced hotel, and there'll be betrayal screams in his coalition, but I think he has a calculus that thinks that way a little bit, and we know he's not ever wedded to anything he's agreed to. Ask his bondholders,
Yeah.
So maybe his lack of a compass can become, in tone and everything, a bit of a plus, although he cannot have a betrayal of those voters who voted to blow up politics if he immediately starts, dining out with Henry Kissinger and meeting with Beltway luminaries. So I think he might try to reinvent himself a bit for popularity, but you never know.
I think the kind of zigzaggy course you're sort of describing or anticipating could work adequately in domestic policy. It might, it can lead you astray a little. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt, when you read the historians, had a little bit of that. He also had a little more grounding, obviously, I think, but of a kind of making deals, sort of betraying some of the hopes of your friends and allies, being a little unpredictable. I mean,
it's kind of, is he Huey Long or is he de Gaulle? That's kind of the fork in his road.
That's interesting. Or even Huey Long or FDR, if you want to be more sort of two contemporary Americans. But I would say, and the FDR example is relevant here, foreign policy is different from domestic policy. For me, the commander-in-chief question has always been the key thing that I balked at with respect to Trump. There, again, a little cleverness, a little unpredictability, a little zigzagging is certainly manageable and sometimes desirable. But on some fundamental issues, when you have a U.S.-supported world order that all in all has done pretty well for the world in the last 70 years, hundreds of millions, billions of people come out of poverty in Asia, we keep the peace in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. That is not something you want to mess around with much, in my opinion. I mean, you want to strengthen it, and I'm not even against sort of bold moves and rethinking tactics and strategies to strengthen it, but that's where I think we need seriousness. So for me, those appointments are important, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and how, and it's some walking back of his dalliance with Putin and his, clever thoughts about let's just renegotiate every trade deal we have.
Who needs NATO? Everything's a parking lot deal of negotiation. Do you think he's going to be able to do better than Mike Flynn? He's open to some new people?
Well, that I don't know. And look, he'll feel loyal. He seems to respect loyalty up towards him, and I assume give some loyalty back down. And on the one hand, that's like a decent personal trait, but I wouldn't say the people he surrounded himself with in the campaign inspire me with much confidence.
I think Flynn would be a great commandant of the Coast Guard. It's time to shake that place up with a new
he
leader.
Was head of, this is General Flynn. He was head of
Defense
DIA and
Intelligence,
was sort of well thought of at the time. But I got to say, you read what he's been saying for the last 2-3 years, and a lot of it's pretty wacky. The Putin thing is genuinely disturbing. This is a really bad guy who's really got a strategic plan to weaken the U.S. and weaken U.S. allies and weaken democracies in countries where they've been recently set up and it's important that they do well. And Trump just seems to have no interest in democracy or, sort of liberty abroad. And you don't have to be on the other extreme and be a crusader for it. That might not be so bad, but you don't have to be that. But he has so little interest in it. So the foreign policy stuff is what I'll watch. I kind of think the economy, for all I know, will have a little economic boom next year, under Trump. I mean, he probably can get a tax deal. He has some sense that if you cut corporate taxes and cut some regulations, you probably will get some economic growth. Obama has heaped an awful lot on. He'll have a Republican Congress. I mean, this is one thing.
An infrastructure deal is not a bad thing for growth if you can get some Davis-Bacon reform and actually get something built for under $1 billion an inch.
I mean, my main thought about the next few weeks, months, years, though, is maybe I'm wrong about this. On the one hand, the system kind of does cause everyone to revert to the mean in a way. So maybe history is a guide and it end up, kind of covering politics in April 2017, it'll look sort of familiar with the White House negotiating with the Speaker of the House and Democrats in the Senate balking at this, but then agreeing to a compromise on that. Or maybe not, though. We really haven't been through this. I mean, it's such a cliche.
And how much does he realign?
It is uncharted waters. I mean, he is not, we don't have any, Reagan became president, he was new, but he'd been governor of California for 8 years. We had some sense of what he might do, how he might work with the legislature. He was very clear on his 2 or 3 biggest priorities, was willing to give up a lot of other stuff to get those through. With Trump, who knows? And so there, I think how much, and this is for me a big question, I'd say a Trump that's constrained by a more, I would say, traditional almost republicanism in the House and the Senate, that mix could be healthy.
Yeah.
A dose of populism with a more traditional, if you want, principled, limited government republicanism and conservatism. And they probably did have to and does have to learn some new lessons.
Yeah, it means Mitch and Ryan are really in a position where they have to assert
But how
themselves.
much, I mean, you've been there and watched a newly elected president who wins in an upset, this kind of victory with the emotions behind it, he'll have an awful lot of steam behind him, and that could be bad because I think a lot of Republicans on the Hill will just decide, whoa, okay, it's Trumpism now.
Yeah,
forget
I
about all that stuff I once learned about certain principles of constitutionalism and limited government. And
that's my biggest worry is that the House decides to become a bunch of Trump imitators.
Yes.
They dump Ryan, they go full on Trump. We're now the protectionism party. The trade stuff, rolls out of control. And will Mitch want to stand in front of that train and try to stop it? I think he might, but it is a
and how do
dicey
people
deal.
run? This will be a very interesting indicator, and I don't know the answer. I mean, 2017, 2018, there's suddenly a lot of candidates running like what I would consider to be a kind of good mix of conservatism and moderate republicanism, forward-looking, principled, but adapting to the times, whether it's a Cory Gardner or Tom Cotton or Joni Ernst or Pat Toomey or Kelly Ayotte and all this. Those are pretty good class in 2010 and then 2014. Or are a lot of people suddenly going to be popping up as Trumpites and maybe even exaggerated versions of Trump, because that's often what happens in politics. And will they be primarying these other people? They have a right to do so. It's a free country. I'm not like, the establishment has to, buckle down and keep everyone out. But personally, I don't think that would be, we do not need a country that has a huge progressive identity politics and anti-state party on the one hand, and a huge populist, nativist, exploiting grievances
party on the other side. Yeah,
if we have that, we'll have that, and then people like us will have to figure out how to influence one or both parties
or
as much as we can, or a new party.
Yeah.
But I still have hopes that the Republican Party does not become a Peronist party.
I think the House will follow Trump out of the box. But a year from now, which is an eternity in politics, and a year before, the beginning of the next primary season, which could be 3 to 6 months, it's in Trump's hands. Because if he turns into Jesse Ventura and it's a comic opera presidency, then I think in the primaries, Trumpism can be slapped down, and should be. If he grows and evolves a little bit and becomes kind of a hybrid with what we have now, then, that could be interesting. And that's really in his hands. He's going to have to chart that course.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it, I think. And again, I think in domestic policy, it would be kind of easier to cut some deals, square some of these circles, get some good tax reform that makes the more supply-side oriented Republicans happy, and some infrastructure that makes some of the more big government Republicans happy, and get some Democrats on board. I can sort of see some of those things ending up not quite where I would want them, but sort of adequate policies. But foreign policy, for me, that'll be very interesting to see.
I heard the drilling noise as the Trump tunnel gets closer and closer. So before we wrap up here, I'd add one thing to that, which is I think its protectionism could become the schism and the focal point and the battle. We'll see how committed
depends
Trump
how
is.
serious he is about it. If he wants to have some conversations about TPP and NAFTA, of course, that's fine. But, you do not want a trade war, and you do not want allies like Japan and Australia to think base. And they're, I'd say, on the bubble here, think, geez, America's just gone crazy. They don't seem to care about us. We went to some risk politically. Prime Minister Abe in Japan is thinking considerable risk to agree to this deal. His rice farmers aren't happy about it.
What nobody knows is it's good for our allies. It's not about China. In fact, it's about isolating China a little bit economically.
And if America
we're going to drive them to the Chinese.
And if America, this is where Congress matters, where Paul Ryan matters, where Mitch McConnell matters. Even if they can't get TPP through, the rhetoric they use, the tone they use, and the tone Trump now uses. Will he continue to talk about China and Japan the way he has for 30 years? Or is there more of a tone? He doesn't have to sound like the Council on Foreign Relations. He doesn't have to sound like Henry Kissinger. But will there be a serious tone about taking our allies seriously and understanding the virtues, the benefits of having strong alliances around the world? That will be important. And some of that, incidentally, won't just be a post-January 20th matter. I think what he does, this is unusual maybe, what he says as president-elect will be uncommonly important. Because if you're Prime Minister Abe, you're not like saying, okay, well, I'm just not doing anything until January 20th. You're watching closely what the next administration does.
In fact, if anything, you're over-interpreting signals.
Yes,
because, there are people stuffed in every major power embassy that look at every semicolon. Somebody asked me last night, if you had the power to make Trump make one phone call and one ask, what would it be? And it was all like, unite the country. No. I would call Mike Levitt and ask for 200 names, because personnel is going to be policy. And he doesn't have the bandwidth to do much of a transition right now. And hopefully he'll get that as a guy who has run organizations with some delegation in them, and get some senior people and some mid-level people in who can run the shop and keep him out of everything, which no president ought to be in anyway. Because I do worry about this small circle.
I gather from people who've dealt with the Trump transition, there now are these transition operations in Washington. The government actually funds them for both parties. It was very small. Christie was officially put in charge and did seem to actually be running it. Then they kind of gave up for a while, but they thought they were going to lose. Then they kind of geared up again in the last week or two. And some of them, I know a couple people who went to meetings there, and some of those were pretty, let's call them normal meetings with intelligent Republican policy types who know about energy or the EPA or transportation and how would you do this. Maybe those people will be at the assistant secretary, deputy secretary level. Maybe the cabinet secretary himself will be some more of a celebrity type or a politician or someone else whom Trump feels some loyalty to. That would be fine. I'm not against having some fresh blood in there, incidentally, obviously, too, and not just the conventional guys who served in previous Republican administrations or,
it's a mix.
Or at the state level. You need a mix. But yeah, I agree. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out.
It would be a great sign of stability fast, which he could use.
Yeah, who will be White House Chief of Staff? Who will be Secretary of State and Defense? Treasury, that's kind of a job that the world looks at and takes seriously.
I hear you've got a great shot at Amtrak.
Yeah,
all is forgiven.
Yeah, well, I am kind of an expert on the Acela, the Northeast Regional.
Exactly.
I would do away with a quiet car, and I will take those arrows for Trump.
Better quality cheese plates, a little more French and imported. Yeah, exactly.
That's good. Yeah, the Brie is really, we could do much better with that, I think.
Well, I think we're going to have to slip into our costumes and escape the city in the short term while we see what happens. Radio Free GOP is going to go on hiatus for a while because I do want our new president-elect to succeed, but we're going to bury the transmitter where we can dig it up if the need arises. So
I'm honored to be the last pre-hiatus guest of this excellent podcast. We'll keep doing our Weekly Standard podcast, and so we'll have you on that, and you can occasionally pop up. But no, look, I very much agree with it. We need to give President-elect Trump a chance, more than a chance. We need to give him a encouragement to do the right thing.
If we had more production turnaround time, because we're trying to rush this one out for tomorrow morning, I would have our big movie trailer announcer come in after we sign off here and say, Mike and Bill were both found dead in an alley 2 hours later. But I doubt that'll happen. I had a nice chat with Reince, and again, we want him to succeed. So as we wrap up, where can people listen to one of those Weekly Standard podcasts, including the new one, the Weekly Substandard, with Vic and Jonathan Last?
That's a funny one. Well,
a funny one about movie and pop culture. But social media, give me the whole, how do people keep up with what you're up to?
I think the easiest way is weeklystandard.com, or you can obviously look at the Weekly Standard on Twitter, or me at Bill Kristol on Twitter. I usually retweet a lot of these things. The Substandard is a very funny cultural podcast with Jonathan Last, Sunday Bunch, and Victorino Mattis, discussing movies I've never heard of, music that I...
Well, you don't get out a lot. So,
I'm kind of a little bit out of it there. Casablanca, a very good movie.
Yeah, it is, exactly. Captain Renault, one of my heroes.
Yeah, Star Wars, that was a big innovation. I'm a little out of touch. But luckily, there are other people at the Weekly Standard who are in touch. Come to weeklystandard.com. You'll see all of the podcasts and the actual... this old-fashioned thing called writing that we do occasionally too. Actual articles and stuff.
And the cruise. If you ever want to be caught with a bunch of right-wing nuts on a cruise ship, there's nothing like it.
True. And we have one. No, we have a great one in December, and then we'll have one next year. We're probably going to try to do Europe. Also, we have events at the Broadmoor Hotel once a year. There's plenty. Weeklystandard.com, you'll find out about all of this.
I do say I have a lot of listeners who ping me emails or tweets and say, I'm a Democrat, but I like to hear the other point of view with some thoughtful arguments, not just name calling. You could do far worse than check out weeklystandard.com, because it is about the battle of ideas, and that's going to become now, in this new era of the Republican Party, more important than ever before. So, Bill Kristol, thank you for doing Radio Free GOP.
Mike, my pleasure, and good luck after the hiatus, and we'll both reemerge. So I'd love to do it again if we're allowed to do it again.
Absolutely. Well, off to Trump Tower. All right. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Mike.
It's number one for rumors and fun. It's Resistance Podcasting, Radio Free GOP.
Okay, that wraps it up with Bill. It's going to be an interesting time, as we discussed. So you're not going to hear the sirens of the orthodoxy police because they won. The forces of Trump order, they prevailed. So, if there are show trials, I may be in the other seat. I think the larger show trial action is going to move over to the Democratic side. Well, a lot of people look at how did the campaign with all the money, all the technology, and all the advantage managed to lose to the most unpopular politician in America. I think there are going to be some recriminations in the Democratic world. I will leave that to them. But until next time, after a little time off, when we figure it out, this has been Radio Free GOP. And I still believe, in the end, for a creative reform conservatism, victory will eventually be ours. Thank you for listening.
Radio Free GOP, the resistance sound all campaign long.
This has been Radio Free GOP, the voice of the Republican resistance, with your host, Mike Murphy.